Hello class, in today's lecture we're going to talk about the English dissenters, and this will deal with Puritans and Presbyterians and Separatists and Baptists and Quakers and all kinds of things. So this will be hopefully a lively discussion. So we want to begin with Puritanism and English dissenters. Dissent in England and Scotland took several forms. You had Puritanism. Especially in Scotland, you had Presbyterianism, you had Catholicism, you had Separatists, and you had Quakers, and there were other smaller groups even than these. Puritanism was predominantly Calvinistic, although not uniformly so. Richard Baxter and John Milton were exceptions. Baxter was on occasion accused of being a crypto-Catholic because of some of his writings on the nature of justification. John Milton was fairly Arminian in his thinking. The Puritans believed that worship should be marked by simplicity. This harks back to Calvin's regulative principle. In Calvin's mind, in the regulative principle, the singing in the church was simply the singing of the Psalms. You take the Psalms from the Old Testament. This was your songbook. And so they sang the Psalter, as they called it, singing the Psalms. Musical instruments generally would not be used. Plain, simple clothing would be the mark of dress, and straightforward preaching in the vernacular language would be the norm. The sacraments would be celebrated in simplicity without pomp and ceremony. Ecclesiastical titles such as bishop and archbishop and these sorts of things would be done away with. The church was governed by a presbytery of elders. The goal of Puritanism was to purify the Church of England of the last vestiges of papism, of papal influence. And so their goal was to stay in the Church of England and purify it. Separatism, however, broke with the Puritans over the question of purifying the Anglican Church. The Separatists said the Anglican Church is a cage of unclean birds. It cannot be fixed. It cannot be mended, and we're out of here. And they separated out. But they shared a common theology and a common practice with the Puritans. They simply disagreed with them over whether or not the Anglican Church could be purified. The Separatists then fragmented among themselves into independents who in America were known as Congregationalists and Baptists, and the Baptists fragmented into two groups. Actually, they didn't fragment, they actually arose independently as two groups. The earliest were the General Baptists. Some would say that they are Proto-Baptist, because the earliest General Baptists did not practice baptism by immersion. They practiced baptism by pouring. These date to about 1612 and were Arminian in their theology, and we'll say more about that in a moment. The other group were the Particular Baptists. They held to particular redemption and were Calvinistic in their theology, and they originated around 1638. Scottish Presbyterianism, brought to Scotland by John Knox, was Calvinistic in its theology, Presbyterian in its church order. So you have the local church level, you have elders, then you have a session, which is the elders of the various churches in a general area. Then you have a synod, then you have a general conference. So you have a Presbyterian church order. You have low church worship again, the regulative principle. And the key leader early on was John Knox, whose grave you can see in a parking lot in Scotland with a name plaque on the parking space that says John Knox is buried here, or something to that effect. You see how much the Scots appreciate John Knox today. His grave has a parking lot over it. But in his day, he was a formidable influence. He was so passionate for the conversion of Scotland. He prayed loudly and strongly, "God, give me Scotland or I'll die." He's extremely evangelistic. Well, how did dissenters relate to the crown? Well, in those days, you could be jailed for your religious opinions. If you differed from the established religion of the Anglican Church, you could be jailed for that. You could be deprived of the right to hold public office. You could be jailed or fined for illegal preaching. The classic case study for this is John Bunyan, who spent about 12 years in the Bedford jail for illegal preaching. But funny story about John Bunyan, the jailer was sympathetic to him. He was jailed on orders of the crown, but the jailer was sympathetic to him and would oftentimes let him go home and see about his family. He had a blind daughter, and go home and see about his family and things like that. Well, he was home with his family one night, and in the middle of the night, he woke up, and it was as if a voice said to him, "You need to be back in your jail cell." And he went immediately back to the jail, put himself in the cell, and locked the door. And in a little bit, a representative of the sheriff showed up making a surprise inspection to make sure that Bunyan was in jail. And after the sheriff's representative left, the jailer said, "I think I shall let you have full leave to come and go as you please. You seem to know when you need to be here better than I do." And but it was from the confines of his jail cell that Bunyan wrote probably one of the most influential works of English literature, The Pilgrim's Progress. So we should never disparage persecution. It often produces lasting results. Sometimes dissenters would be elected to an office as a pretext for arresting them, because they'd be elected to office for which you could be punished if you did not assume the role and responsibility to which you'd been elected. But since they were dissenters and would not agree to the Anglican church order, they could not accept the office. Therefore, they would be arrested and put in jail for failure to do their public duty and serve in their elected office. So dissenters looked for ways to escape. The Mayflower Pilgrims that we hear about at Thanksgiving were separatists who fled to the New World. And out of that group of separatists came John Smith. And we'll talk about him in a little bit. He was part of that group before they set out for the New World. He and his group went to Holland. Roger Williams also fled as a separatist from England, but became a Baptist briefly, when I say briefly, 4 months in North America. These are just examples of the way dissenters tried to escape persecution. Many of them went to Holland because there was religious liberty there. How did King James respond to the Puritans? Well, King James of England, King James I of England, came to the throne after the death of Elizabeth I, who died childless. And he was King James the Sixth of Scotland. And he disliked the Calvinists from his dealings with Scottish Presbyterians. He was Catholic in his sentiments at heart, and the Scottish Presbyterians had been a thorn in his side throughout his reign. He held the Puritans in contempt. But he produced the authorized version, we know it today as the King James Version, as an attempt to pacify dissenters with a new common translation. And the first publishing of it contained the Apocrypha. Now, it would be nearly 100 years before dissenters would accept and use the authorized version. They considered it a contaminated and corrupted translation because it had the king's seal on it. And so, for instance, when you read Pilgrim's Progress, you're reading the text from the Geneva Bible. This is the English translation that Bunyan and other dissenters used instead of the King James Version. But the king tried to pacify the dissenters. It was during this time period that we see the rise of the Baptists. John Smith, spelled with a Y, and Thomas Helwys gave birth to what we know today as the General Baptist. Smith established a separatist congregation around 1606. He was originally Calvinistic in his theology. 1610, he was living in exile in Holland along with Helwys, and they produced a short confession of faith that based church membership on believers' baptism. Smith, though, through disputations in writing, came to doubt the validity of his self-baptism and sought membership in the Mennonite church. When he came to the idea of believers' baptism, he knew of no one qualified to baptize him, so he baptized himself, pouring water over his head. Then he baptized Thomas Helwys, and then together they baptized everyone else. He later came to doubt this self-baptism and sought membership in the Mennonite church, but the Mennonites suspected that he was theologically flaky, constantly on the move, never could settle in one place, and sort of held him in check, debating whether or not to admit him until he died in 1612 from, I think, tuberculosis. And then after his death in 1612, his congregation was absorbed into the Mennonite church and vanished from history. The character of the beast was his defense of his departure from separatism and his embracing believers' baptism. It was written in 1609. Now, when he renounced his self-baptism and started seeking membership in the Mennonite church, Thomas Helwys said, "No, we're not going there." And Helwys broke with Smith at this point, and a portion of the congregation sided with Helwys. In 1611, Helwys produced a new confession and brought his congregation back to England to suffer for and bear testimony to the gospel as they understood it. He died in prison in 1614. Here's how he got there. He published a work called A Short Declaration of the Mystery of Iniquity in 1612 as a plea for religious liberty and sent it to the king. The king thanked him by locking him in the tower, where he stayed until he died. Smith was more Pelagian in his view of original sin and more Catholic in his view of justification, while Helwys was more thoroughly Arminian in his views of both. And so if you want a more purely Arminian theology among General Baptists, look at Thomas Helwys's writings. Smith, in his writings, completely rejected the doctrine of original sin, which would make him Pelagian, and he embraced a kind of view of justification by faith plus works, which would make him more in line with the Catholics. The particular Baptist beginnings are a little different. They began with what's called the Jacob Lathrop Jesse Church, which was a separatist congregation. It's often referred to shorthand in Baptist literature as the JLJ Church. It was a separatist congregation. And out of this separatist congregation arose the early Baptist leaders who came to be convinced on the study of the New Testament that believers' baptism was the proper basis for constituting the church, and they petitioned the larger body for peaceful separation, that they might form a believers' church. And the parent church said, absolutely, we give you full permission to do so, and support them. And they maintained friendly and cordial relationships for over a century between the two churches. And so this is a best-case scenario church split, where the one group says, we feel led this way, we would like to go and do this, but we want goodwill between us. And the parent church says, go with our blessing, and let's keep this friendly channel open. Early particular Baptist leaders included John Spilsbury, who wrote The Lawful Subjects of Baptism, an excellent work on believers' baptism and the basis for organizing a called-out congregation of believers. John Bunyan, who wrote Holy War and Pilgrim's Progress. Now, I have to give this caveat about Bunyan. There are those who make him a separatist or Puritan and those who make him a Baptist. And the reason being, he pastored a Baptist church, but a Baptist church whose previous pastor, who had died, practiced open membership and open communion. And so they practiced believers' baptism in the church, but they did not require it of everyone, only of those who asked for it. And so there's some debate about whether Bunyan was truly a Baptist, or was he part separatist or Puritan, or what was he? Benjamin Keach began his ministry as a General Baptist, as an Arminian, but converted to Calvinism, became a significant leader among particular Baptists, and his key theological contribution was his concept of the eternal covenant of salvation, which he drew from the book of Hebrews. Hansard Knollys was another key leader, and William Kiffin. William Kiffin was a wealthy middle-class merchant, and he was so wealthy, in fact, that at one time the king asked him for a loan of 30,000 pounds. To which he responded with a gift of 10,000 pounds and said to a friend that he had saved himself 20,000 pounds in the process, recognizing that he knew the king would never pay the 30,000 pounds back. He's extremely wealthy. We have the period of the interregnum and the Restoration. This is the period of the English Civil War and its impact on Baptist life. The interregnum is a period of English Civil War that we'll talk about more in detail, but it was a huge boom to the Baptists. Baptists grew under Cromwell, who was Lord Protector during the interregnum, in both numbers and influence. But at the end of the interregnum, with Charles II assuming the throne, persecution resumed. Then when William and Mary came to the throne in 1688, they brought with them the Act of Toleration, which granted religious tolerance to all Trinitarian Christians. At the same time, though, religious fervor and sentiment went into decline among all people groups and all social classes. And so a period of spiritual and religious melees set in. It's during this time period that London Baptists produced two key doctrinal statements. In 1644, they produced their first major doctrinal statement, the First London Confession. In 1677, and then reissued again in 1689, they produced the Second London Confession of Faith. And the Second London Confession of Faith borrowed from two Presbyterian confessions. It borrowed predominantly from the Westminster Confession and also from the Savoy Declaration. The Westminster Confession and Savoy Declaration are almost identical, but the Savoy Declaration advocates a single predestination, a single election of the redeemed, and a passing over of the rest, whereas the Westminster Confession affirms double predestination, that God is predetermined and predestined a certain number to salvation and a certain number to damnation. Baptists embraced the single election concept in the Savoy Declaration. So they dropped the double predestinarian language of the Westminster Confession of Faith. They added a Baptist flavor to their treatment of the ordinances and the nature of the church. I made a comment to a very conservative Presbyterian friend of mine who accused the Baptist of ripping off the Westminster Confession. I said, no, they took a good confession and perfected it. She didn't appreciate that. The missionary enterprise also began with the particular Calvinistic Baptist. And this is important to remember in a day and an age when we're constantly told that Calvinists are not mission-minded and they're not evangelistic. This is where the missionary enterprise began with Baptists. It began with two particular Baptist pastors, William Carey and Andrew Fuller. William Carey went to England as the first Baptist missionary from England. He went to India, and Andrew Fuller stayed at home as secretary of the fledgling Baptist Missionary Society, which is not what it was called at the time. It had a huge, long name that we'll talk about maybe if we ever do a Baptist history course. But Fuller stayed back in England as the secretary and the principal fundraiser and support raiser for the missionary movement. And Fuller published a significant work in this regard. He published a book called The Gospel Worthy of All Acceptation. And you can find it online and you can read it, and it is well worth the reading. William Carey produced a defense of missions in a day when people didn't think you should do missions, called An Inquiry into the Obligation of Christians for the Conversion of the Heathen. And that's another book you can find. It's reproduced in Timothy George's biography, A Faithful Witness, and you can find it in other places, and it too is well worth the reading. And what is significant is that to know that William Carey was self-taught most of his life. He had an aptitude for languages, and he taught himself, while in England, he taught himself Greek and Hebrew and Dutch, and I think Latin. In India, he mastered 11 different Indian languages and translated the Bible into those. So he was a masterful language person and did great work in that regard. Well, we want to finish this lecture by talking about the English Civil War. Charles I, son of King James, was deposed and beheaded for treason against the British people under the terms of the Magna Carta, the only English king to be so treated. Oliver Cromwell rose up as Lord Protector, and this Civil War created problems with Scotland, where Charles was also king. The Scottish Presbyterians didn't like him. They said he was a scoundrel, but by golly, he was their scoundrel, and the English should not have killed him. Cromwell ruled as Lord Protector from 1641 to 1659. He would not accept the title of king. He would not accept the crown. But he also, on his deathbed, realized that his son was not up to the task of ruling, and so arrangements were made for the restoration of the crown. During the interregnum, dissenters were favored. Cromwell especially favored dissenters who served in his military. Baptists gained their first opportunity for open expression of their beliefs. The First London Baptist Confession, first published in 1641, later republished in 1644, became a benchmark for particular Baptist belief. The Westminster Confession was completed in 1646. The scripture proofs were completed in 1647. And the Westminster Confession remains to this day the benchmark for English Protestant confessions of faith. So that covers that period. In our next lecture, we will deal with the rise of rationalism and how this impacted the life of the church, especially in Europe and England. And we'll get from there into the revival movements. So that wraps up this lecture.